For us to truly understand the slavery that is consistently referenced in the New Testament, we have to constantly remind ourselves that the slavery that was known and practiced in the ancient world, and specifically in the Roman Empire, was quite different in some very key ways to the slavery that we are more attuned to that occurred in the American South. Some enslaved peoples in the Roman Empire were afforded the ability to control vast amounts of wealth, have positions of power and influence, move around their city or region without having to bear any clues to their status as an enslaved person. And manumission was a regular occurrence. And we'll get to some of that in the next session. But in this session, before we get to the sunnier possibilities of life for a slave in the Roman Empire, I want to remind us all of the horrific and dehumanizing aspects of Roman slavery. To be a slave in the ancient Roman Empire meant that you were the property of someone else. You were considered property, literally. A slave had the same status as someone's cattle or other beast of burden. You were a tool for someone's use. In many times and places, Roman law allowed for the killing of a slave with no legal repercussions whatsoever. Just like you're welcome to slaughter a cow or a goat or a chicken because they are yours to do with as you will, you could absolutely slaughter your slave. Their status as slave thus meant that they were less than human. Now, just like I try and keep my chickens happy and healthy, because ultimately that means I will see better egg production, many slaveholders wanted to keep their slaves happy and healthy because then they would be better workers in their homes and in their businesses. There were slave marriages. Two slaves would fall in love and get married. This, of course, made them happy, right? But because they are considered property and less than human, their marriages weren't legal, and they certainly weren't binding on their masters. A slave could absolutely be split up from their mate. They could be sold off to another master somewhere else. Or the children of those slave couple could be sold off to another household. There was no legal protection whatsoever for a slave family. They could be broken up and sold or used in whatever way the master saw fit. A slave belonged completely and totally to their master. This included their sexuality too. A slave could absolutely be required to sexually service their master or anyone else in their household. It was not just individuals who could own slaves, but the state, the city, or even an entity like a pagan temple could and did own slaves. Many temples used slaves for all manner of things, including using them as temple prostitutes. It was considered better to be a slave in an urban household. Such slaves lived with their masters and had relationships with them. There was the possibility for some humanization and fraternity. A slave master could become quite fond of their slave, and vice versa. Slaves of the state or slaves in the rural farmlands had it much harder. There was little to no chance of being seen as a fellow human being, and oftentimes the work was backbreaking. Because slavery was so terrible, and because there was no outward identification of a slave, there was no slave uniform, and there was no racial component to slavery at all. It was a commonplace occurrence for a slave to run away. One common punishment for a runaway slave was public crucifixion. As we know, it was a horrific way to die, and by displaying the crucified bodies for all to see, it acted as a deterrent for slaves who were thinking of trying to make a run for it. Another common punishment for runaways was branding. They would brand a runaway slave on the forehead as a permanent sign that the person was a slave. They could no longer go about life looking like anyone else. And can you even imagine the pain of such a branding on your face? In short, the Roman practice of slavery was brutal and terrible. It was also dehumanizing for the slave, certainly, but I think you could also make a good argument for the dehumanizing of the masters too.